This Buster Brown stuff out of here. Oh yeah, that's Smilin It. We watch his show every day. What are you talking about? That show ain't been on in years. Well, I don't know. We get it on that set every day. Now, in this book, a thing that occasionally happens is that at a few points, there are stories within stories. In this case, it seems to have something to do with their TV set, which also seems to be haunted because shows that no one has seen for years seem to be showing up on it on a pretty regular basis. In this case, it's a story called The Man Who Would Be Waldo. Hey, Waldo, you're on TV. Wait a minute. With mounting rage, I watched as a sorry pageant, almost forgotten, unfolded on the little screen. Listen, go ahead and laugh if you want, but that ain't me. Uh-huh. Yeah, sure. That's right. And if you just shut your yaps a minute, I'll tell you about the man who would be Waldo. Hey, it was weird. And the whole thing probably never would have happened but for a twist of fate that found me out in front of the Blarney Rose Bar back in 1954. I'd just been reading that the old Fontaine Fables cartoons were about to be released to TV. You know the ones. Yeah, sure. Well, naturally this interested me since most of those cartoons starred yours truly. And in the 1930s, when he was just a little kid, Wally Felder was my biggest fan. Short in stature, large in nose, Wally actually looked something like me, and he'd often amuse the other kids by impersonating me. Of course, I didn't know about any of this when he came flying out of the Blarney Rose Bar that day. Well, naturally, when I heard all these cracks coming from the bar about Waldo, I was sure they were for me. Uh-huh. But when I dared them to say that stuff to my face, they marched right back into the bar like I wasn't there. Which really shouldn't have surprised me. It was their calling my name that threw me. Then Wally piped up and said, "Keep your shirt on, mister. Those insults were meant for me. You see, they think I'm..." Then he looked and saw me. Yow! Well, you know, since he thought I was just some imaginary cartoon character, seeing me kind of threw him. So I cut him in on the wine I was drinking and clued him in on a few other things. I explained that I was as real as he was, but being a low-grade demon and all, only a few flaky losers, like himself, could actually see me. Hey, tell me about it. Like that pitiful bum Ted Mishkin that I trained up to do all those Waldo cartoons. And you better believe I straightened him out on who the real brains on that deal was. And Wally filled me in on his own pitiful background. He was still doing that tired-out impersonation of me in bars, caging drinks with it, when he could. But as he babbled on, I took another look at my paper, and an idea began to take hold. Sometimes I do wonder about what I did next. I suppose that animated cartoon episode with Mishkin had left a bad taste in my mouth. I guess I just had to prove I could do it again, and with the commonest conceivable clay. And in Wally Felder, I saw that clay. My idea was to dress him up like me, teach him some of my old routines, and try to ensconce him as host of the Fontaine Fables cartoon show on TV. Hell, all he'd really have to do was introduce my old cartoons and sell stuff in between. Just the same. For the next 6 weeks, I worked that sap long and hard. And at the audition, Wally floored him. When Fontaine Funtime premiered, by God, Wally Felder was me. Wally was actually more popular than the cartoons, and he was great at commercials. It seemed like he could sell just about anything. But predictably it all went to his head. He began to wear that damn Waldo suit everywhere. I couldn't get him to rehearse, and worse yet, he was starting to treat me like a lackey. Something definitely had to give. The way I saw it, Wally needed a lesson. So, on April 1st, 1954, instead of doing the show with Wally, I decided to sit one out and watch the show from a local bar. Well, you can see what a disaster that was. I never dreamed things would backfire that bad. But Wally was in no forgiving mood. He was through on TV, and through with me, too. He did manage to bum drinks on the strength of his notoriety for a while. But then winter came. I kind of lost touch with Wally after that, although I did hear he was working in the Hubert's Museum Freak Show. Yeah, there we go. Over on 42nd Street. But that was a rough show. And it probably hastened Wally's inevitable finish. They found him, frozen dead on New Year's Eve in an old piano crate. His final home, now a coffin. And so, as the curtain rang down on 1954, Wally Felder, the man who would be Waldo, was no more. And that's a taste of Smilin' Ed. I hope you all have enjoyed it. And that's the end of my piece of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I've had kind of a hard time figuring out what to say to this new book, Artichoke Tales. It took me 10 years to finish, and I wasn't sure how to sum up a 10-year project. In many ways, the book I recently completed is a different book than the one I set out to make in 1999. And while talking to some friends about my quandary, I realized that Artichoke Tales contains almost all of the different themes that have driven my work since I started drawing comics in 1991. Since then, the concerns that motivate me to make comics have changed, and I can see those 19 years roughly divided up into phases. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. It's going to be kind of a retrospective. I think my primary motivation when I start a new comic is inquiry. A story is a way of puzzling out some things about the world or myself that I don't understand. The stories don't necessarily provide answers, but at least they deepen my thinking. I first started making comics at the end of my college years. I had a boyfriend in college who was a big comics fan, and he admired my drawings, and he felt my skills would be best put to use by making comics. So he tried to interest me in comics by showing me Dave Mazzucchelli's Daredevil, Frank Miller's Batman, the Hernandez brothers' Love and Rockets, but just didn't excite me too much. But then one day he showed me Dirty Plot by Julie Doucet. And the story I remember most was Julie waking up in the morning, and she's got her period, and she levitates herself to the bathroom so that she doesn't leak all over her sheets and her underpants. And I looked at that and I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to do that. So that's when I started drawing comics. My first comics were a mishmash of feminist theory, Marxist historical materialism, identity politics, and labor history, all subjects I'd been steeped in for 4 years at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington in the late 80s. I don't know about you, but when I was in college, I tended to have these exhausting dreams that were basically nonsense reiterations of all the new words and concepts and facts I was assimilating every day in school. And I think of my early comics as these dreams put to paper, an attempt to personalize and to own all of the book learning I'd done at college. I embarked upon an epic tale of feminist cyberpunk science fiction called Bottle Cap. I was so afraid to try drawing comics that my first version of the story was told with a series of photographs. And incidentally, the girl in this picture turned as my friend Virginia, and she turned out to be the editor for Artichoke Tales. At this time in the late 80s in Olympia, everyone was making zines and starting bands and doing all kinds of grandiose DIY projects, so I started bragging that I was going to make a comic book. I got a lot of attention for it, which was fun, but then I realized I had to actually sit down and draw it. Once I finally screwed up my courage and started to draw comics, even though it was really hard, I felt like I'd come home artistically. I'd always enjoyed writing stories and drawing, but I'd never managed to figure out how to put it all together. I serialized Bottle Cap in 6 issues of my self-published comic book Girl Hero. It was kind of a disaster. I managed to paint myself into a corner narratively pretty early on, and I never felt like I had any control over the story. I lost my way, and I lost the joy of it about halfway through, but I stubbornly completed it. And even though I didn't love it anymore, I'm glad I finished. I don't care to ever read it again, though. It was good practice, and some of the political themes I grappled with found their way in a slightly more nuanced fashion into Artichoke Tales. One of the themes I worked on repeatedly in those early episodes of Bottle Cap, and I was still interested in with Artichoke Tales, was how clashes between people who want different things change over time, and how at certain times the powerless turn the tables and acquire power. Most of my college professors were historians who were committed to researching and telling the stories of the powerless who brought about social change through collective action, and this was something I really wanted to put in my comics. I found, though, that one of the main problems with depicting dramatic moments of social change, such as demonstrations, religious gatherings, marches, riots, and wars, is that they almost always involve huge crowd scenes, and crowd scenes are very difficult and time-consuming to draw. I started working on Artichoke Tales a few years after my friend Jason Lutz undertook his massive epic Berlin, and I've always been inspired and awed by his beautifully drawn crowd scenes. I self-published Girl Hero from 1992 to 1996. And the handsome young fella next to me in this picture is John Lewis. He's sort of hiding behind his True Swamp poster. And the format of my Girl Hero comic book was this ongoing story, Bottle Cap, and then backup stories to round out each issue to 24 pages. And it was in those backup stories that I found my next great theme, sex. Whatever you are, whether you're an artist, an athlete, a couch potato, an auto mechanic, sex is probably the great theme of your early 20s. I came of age in the mid-late 80s at the height of the fear of AIDS. It was before antiretroviral drugs had been discovered, so HIV was pretty much a death sentence. My generation was taught a version of sex ed that was extremely clinical and pretty terrifying. Often I hear people suggest that making art is a form of therapy. I shy away from this view of art because it seems self-indulgent. However, I must confess that almost all of the stories I did about sex in my 20s were attempts to come to grips with the whole confusing thing. I was raised to be a feminist, and I embraced feminism and studied it in college, but in my early 20s I found it awful hard to be a feminist in bed. Anyway, these stories grew out of my bewilderment about the whole thing and my attempts to recast some confusing, unpleasant experiences, or perhaps just to slow them down in order to make sense of them. This page is from a story called Pennyroyal Tea, which was in Girl Hero number 5, and it was the first appearance of the Artichoke people. And it was from doing this story that I kind of realized I wanted to do a much larger story with them. By the time I began Artichoke Tales, I was more of a veteran in the sex department. I'd had a few boyfriends, I was in love and engaged to be married, and I just felt more in control of that aspect of my life. I think the sexuality in Artichoke Tales is mostly quite joyful. There's a lot of conflict in the story, but it's not played out so much in the sexual relationships. That's comparatively sunny stuff.